Hi everyone, thank you for joining today. So my name is Steve Bromley and I am a user researcher. Today I'm here to talk about games user research. How can we apply the skills and practice from UX and user research studies in order to make games better? A little bit about my background. As mentioned, I worked at PlayStation as a user researcher for 5 years on big titles like Horizon, ones that were fun to playtest like SingStar, and also working with very small teams who only had a few employees but had a huge ability to actually make changes based on the things that we were learning. An example of that type of game was PlayStation Vita Pets, but we worked with a lot of small teams as well as these bigger, more commercial titles. In my last year at PlayStation, a lot of my focus was on the PlayStation VR headset and also the launch lineup, so a lot of the games that were coming out there, which also had a lot of very interesting research challenges because VR as a medium was very new and lots of interesting things to think about. Since then, I do a bit to work with game teams to help them integrate user research into their development process, as well as working at Reach, as Stuart mentioned. Also, alongside this, I started and I ran for 5 years the Games User Research Mentoring Scheme, which put people who were interested in learning about the industry or interested in becoming user researchers in touch with people at companies such as Ubisoft, EA, Activision, Microsoft, and other big game companies where they already had established researchers to learn a bit more about how it works, what you need to do to become a games user researcher, and how to join the industry. A lot of the lessons from that mentoring scheme I recently wrote into a book called How to Be a Games User Researcher, which I released earlier this month. So today I want to give a broad overview of the topic. First, we'll explore what is games user research. Then we'll go into depth into, okay, what does a study actually look like and how does it compare to traditional playtesting in games? And then the last thing to explore is how do I actually become a games user researcher? If you're interested in this field and want to explore it further, what are some good skills to have and what are some good steps to take to develop those skills further? So first of all, what is games user research? In a sentence, games user researchers run structured playtests to make games better. We're going to explore both of those things in more depth. So how do you run a structured playtest and what is a structured playtest? And also, how does it make games better? I'll start with making games better. So, games development is very hard. There's a number of reasons for this. An overwhelming factor is just how big and complex games are. Working on a game involves having a multidisciplinary team with lots of different strengths. You have people with job titles around art or design or programmers or producers, all these team members working together. Their work is very interdependent. So what one team does has a huge impact on what other teams are working on. You work simultaneously on it. And also with games, it takes 3 to 5 years. And on that journey, you're learning things and changing the spec. You don't start with a strong idea of this is what we're going to make and then just produce it. You learn as you go, and the fun of the game is discovered and explored as you go along. That makes it very hard to define upfront what the work is and a very complex software project to work on. Alongside that, games have a very hard deadline they have to hit, which often doesn't sit very well with having such complex software development. There's some factors that influence this. Big games these days spend as much on marketing as they do on development. On that graph, you can see, for example, Cyberpunk 2077 had a huge marketing spend that vastly outweighed its development cost, and other big games like Destiny or Grand Theft Auto, it's almost equal. Marketing spend is often booked a year or more in advance, and that puts a very hard deadline on launch. If the game is not ready by that deadline, you will have to reschedule your marketing or miss your marketing spend, and that can be as expensive as making the whole game again. Also, that launch window is tremendously important. This graph from a game called Rock Legend shows just how many of the sales you make on that first few days or the first few weeks of sales. And so again, if you miss the opportunity and your game isn't of appropriate quality or isn't ready on launch, you've missed. It has a huge impact on the success of your project. And the last thing that makes games development hard is just how different the people who make games are from their players. Once you spend 3 to 5 years making a game, you become an expert in exactly how that game works. You can play it very well often, but you are not like the normal person who's going to buy that at home and sit in front of it for the first time. It becomes very difficult for you to anticipate what they're going to understand or what they're not going to understand, which makes tutorialization very difficult. And also the difficulty balance will be way off if you're not getting outside input and just relying on what's the right difficulty for me when I've played this game for 5 years. So to help all these problems, iteration can help make it better. Instead of just coming up with what you want the game to be and then working on it for 3 to 5 years and then launching it, if you iterate your idea and your implementation of the idea, you can improve the quality of it. So the launch experience is much better than it would be if you didn't iterate it. And one form of inspiration for that iteration is user research. So user researchers, we run research studies throughout development to help inspire those iterations and to raise the quality of the final experience. Early on, the type of research questions that we might be looking at include understanding people's context from how they play games currently. So how do people play games currently, or where are they playing them? Particularly with some things like mobile games or augmented reality or virtual reality, understanding the context in which people are playing will have an impact on what features do you make for them or how do you implement the game. You can also learn from other games experiences early on. So rather than start reinventing the wheel from the start, you can look at what other games have done well, how have they implemented tutorials or crafting or other mechanics in the game, and take advantage of what other teams have done rather than starting from the beginning. Also early on, you want to explore, is this concept fun? If we do spend 3 to 5 years making this game, is the end result going to be a fun experience that people like? Later on development, the type of research questions that user researchers will address changes. They can include, do players understand what they're meant to do in the game? Do they understand what's happening in the game and the story? Are they able to do these things? And is the difficulty set correctly? Is the difficulty they're encountering what we expected it to be? The reason why we run these type of research studies, I guess, is pretty explicit, but finding these type of problems early on is much more useful than discovering them late. You will discover these problems eventually, but you don't want to discover them in the reviews after it's launched or in all the feedback and criticism you're getting online. And so finding these problems during development gives you more time to react and more options that you can draw upon to resolve some of these problems. So we think it's good to find these problems earlier. And as we mentioned on the graph, it leads to higher quality games by giving you more opportunities to iterate your design and your implementation of that design. You can create a better game than you would if you didn't iterate it. Now, none of these ideas are particularly new or particularly revolutionary, and other fields of software development do all these things all the time. Whether you're making a website or an app, you will want to run research studies throughout development to help improve the quality and make sure you're meeting the needs of your users. There are, however, some nuances with games, which mean they can be a bit different to other types of software, a couple of which I'll touch upon now. The first thing that we think about when we're running user research studies for games is the idea that games are art. Unlike other software, they're not necessarily meeting a need. We're not making an app to allow people to book a taxi where we can understand what their user needs are and then create something that fulfills that need. Instead, games are a creative enterprise, and so our start from all of this is, what is the designer's creative vision? One of the things that we have to explain and work closely with our designers so that they do understand is the point of research isn't to change your artistic vision, it isn't to make it more mainstream. The point of our user research studies is to make sure that players are experiencing your creative vision in the way in which you hope they would, and they're not experiencing any barriers like usability problems or frustration that stops them having the experience that you hope they have when you're designing a game. Another thing that's important about games is that friction is an important part of that experience. Again, thinking about other apps or other software, if it's difficult to book your taxi or difficult to set up a meeting, that is a problem in software and a thing you need to fix. In games, difficulty is part of the experience, and there's work such as The Theory of Fun by Raf Costa, who says that actually the fun of the game is encountering a challenge that is difficult and then applying new skills to overcome something that was difficult for you before. And so difficulty is an important part of having a good, fun experience. You could imagine a game like Mario, where Mario's goal is to save the princess, could be replaced by this button. The player just presses the button, the princess is saved, and the game is over. That has no friction, but it is also not fun. So what a user researcher working in games has to think about is what is the intended difficulty and the intended challenge, and what is unintended or accidental difficulty, and only making changes to remove the accidental difficulty to reveal that intended difficulty and intended design. Also, what's very important in games, it's important in other types of software, but particularly for games, is how important secrecy is. We talked about how important the marketing spend and how expensive the marketing spend for games is. And because of that, game studios are very careful about what information gets leaked or gets shared publicly. They have a very avid fan base who are looking for any information that's out there, and there's a big market for people to learn about secret upcoming games. Because of that, we as researchers have to be very careful when we're putting people in front of prototypes or early versions of software, so that we don't leak information that is valuable to journalists or is of interest to that wider market and ruins the game's marketing schedule and plan. That means that some of the research methods that you would apply in other forms of user research study are less relevant or less useful or accessible to us as games user researchers. It's very common outside of games to, for example, do unmoderated studies where people can take part from home. They can log onto a website, they can follow some tasks and it records what they do. And then that video gets sent back to the researcher to analyze in their own time. That type of thing is less compatible with games user research because we don't want to allow footage of the game out into the wild that early, often. So, as I've hopefully explained this first bit, games user researchers run studies, and our studies are to ensure that players experience the game as designed. We're very careful when we work with design teams to emphasize how we're not trying to change their artistic vision. We're not trying to make the game any easier. Instead, we just want to make sure that what you think you're putting into the world is the same as what you actually are putting into the world from the player's experience. So what does that actually look like, and how does a games user research study work? The idea of playtesting isn't new in games, and I imagine any game designer or game studio you ask, they would say, oh yeah, we do playtesting, don't worry about that, we know all about that already. And their understanding of playtesting is we'll get some people to play the game, and then we'll get them to fill out a questionnaire and report back what they think about the game. That's fine, it's a good start, but when we take the skills from UX research and user research and other disciplines, we recognize that this method is leaking a lot of data. You're missing a lot of opportunities to learn from these players, and also isn't appropriate for a lot of the research objectives that a game designer might have. And so what we as games user researchers do is raise the maturity of playtesting by bringing in this practice from other fields. For us, running a playtest to a professional standard is a semi-structured process that goes through each of these steps that I'm going to talk through in depth. But in brief, we'll define some research objectives, we'll pick an appropriate method, we'll find the right types of players for it, we'll design the study, we'll then moderate and note-take a study, analyze what we've learned and debrief it. And a user researcher, both in games and outside of games, will be comfortable and familiar with doing each of these steps. So the first one, defining the research objectives. Really what we're trying to do here is understand what do the team need to learn in order to make good decisions. So that involves a lot of close collaboration with your design team, your designers, your producers, the artists, those people working the game, to work out what decisions they're about to make or what decisions they've recently made, and then convert those into research objectives that we can answer with a study. The types of research objective you might encounter include, does the tutorial successfully teach people key mechanics such as how to craft? Do players know where to go in this level? And if they don't, why do they not know where to go? As we talked earlier about the difficulty, is the difficulty fair? And with a puzzle, can players solve the puzzle? All of these, the designers will have made some decisions when they're crafting the tutorial or the difficulty or the puzzle, and we want to check that those decisions were correct and are creating the right type of player experience. So that first step is meet with your game team, understand what they're working on, and craft that into some research objectives. We'll then take each of those research objectives and think about, okay, what type of method or what type of study would reliably answer those research objectives? To pick the right sort of research method, and we'll go through some in a second, but a researcher will ask themselves questions such as, okay, to answer this objective, do I need to measure something? Do I need to understand what players' behavior is? Do I need to understand what players are thinking? And also some pragmatic things such as how much time do we have available and what have we done before in this space will help inform what's the right method. There are some common ones though. Okay. One of the first methods that user researchers might become familiar with is the idea of doing usability reviews. This is when one or more researchers play through the game themselves, and so it doesn't rely on outside players, and instead the researcher looking at the game themselves. They'll bring their knowledge of best practice and their previous experience from running sessions, and then identify what they think will be potential usability issues before it goes into a test. This method has some limitations, you can imagine, because we're not speaking with real users. It can be less comprehensive than doing a fuller study, and also less convincing. Just you as a user researcher saying, oh, I think there's a problem here, is less convincing than that video of a player having a problem. But it can be useful in some instances. It takes very little time, so compared to other types of study, it can be something that does fit into a very tight time schedule. Often this can be very useful before running a fuller study with real users. Because it can help identify some of the obvious issues, that means they can be resolved before you run a full study. And that will mean that you can learn more interesting things from your real study, having removed all the obvious issues in the game. Also, we talked about how important secrecy is. That again can be very useful for usability reviews because there's no players in it. It means there's no chance of leaks. Much more common and much more comprehensive though is applying one-to-one usability testing. So most games user research labs have a room that's set up vaguely like a living room, although in this particular picture, it's a very austere living room with a sofa and a TV and games console. We'll bring in a player, we'll put them in front of the game, and then we'll watch them play. A moderator will usually sit in the room with them and both give them tasks. So say to the player, please play through the tutorial on the first level. They'll also ask questions. So they'll look at what the player's doing and at the right time, probe with questions to make sure that we understand what they're thinking and why we're seeing the behavior that we're seeing in the game. This method allows us to observe player behavior very closely and then get a good understanding about why that behavior occurred. And so for some of the research objectives, this is very appropriate. It allowed us to see what players understand and what they can't do, and then give the right information to game designers to help players understand or be able to complete the challenges they're set in the game. Another method, and this one is a bit more bespoke to games user research than in other industries, is the idea of multi-seat testing. So sometimes you need a quant measure. You need to measure how long does it take people to complete levels, how many times do people die on a level. You might need to measure some opinions, what do players think about each level on a Likert scale. And for that type of quant measure, you need a lot of players to play. Because of the secrecy issues we talked about, we can't send players home with the game and measure it remotely. And so it's very typical for games user research labs to have areas like in the picture. We have lots of pods, so 10, 20 or 40 players even can play the game simultaneously. Meanwhile, we'll capture data from them. We'll capture both analytics from the game about what happens in the game, and also through methods like surveys, capture their impressions and what their recognition of what's happening in the game is. So this doesn't give us that depth of understanding that we'll get from one-to-one testing, but it is useful for other types of research questions, such as when we need to measure opinions or balance difficulty. Regardless of the method you pick, the next step is often recruiting participants. Again, this is very familiar to people who have worked with UX research in other industries, but we are very interested in finding realistic players. If you get the wrong type of player, you'll definitely learn issues. For example, if someone had never played a first-person shooter before where they have to use both the sticks to move, if you put them in front of the game and it is requires both the sticks, they're not going to be able to progress in the game, they're going to fail entirely, but it's unrealistic. Most people who play first-person shooters will have played other ones, and so although that is a usability issue, it's not an interesting one or relevant to our audience. Because of that, we recruit on games that people have played before, games that they've bought before, and their experience. We're less interested in demographics. In general, user research as a field recognizes that people's behavior is a good indicator of a good way to segment their audience and identify a range of issues rather than using demographics as a proxy for that. Then a user researcher will design the study. So we have our objectives, we have our method, the method we're going to apply, but actually what are the tasks we're going to set players? When we bring them in, what are we going to tell them? What are we going to ask them as they're playing through it? And what are we going to be looking out for to make sure that we recognize if they're able to do it or not? That is a lot of where the discipline of user researchers come in. So in this example in the picture, we've got the objective of, do players learn how to use the jetpack? And so the user researcher has to come up with an appropriate task, which is play the tutorial level and go through the game. And we'll look out as they're playing through the tutorial for, have they understood the jetpack tutorial and can they use it or do they fail? By doing all of that and coming up with a structure for your study, you can be confident that your study will answer the objectives that you've been set for the study. We also, as user researchers, have to sort out the technology, and often tech can be significantly difficult for these types of studies. We're working with unfinished software on consoles that aren't home consoles, they're a developer console and so technically quite complex. We often want to record the video feed or stream it elsewhere, and so it requires some technology skills to set all this up, which is another part of what a user researcher will be comfortable with. Then the study begins, and the user researcher will both moderate the study, so they will be sat in the room with the participant, coming up on the fly with the types of questions that they want to ask, responding to the player's behavior. And also it's very common behind the scenes to have another researcher watching the session. That researcher will be taking notes about what they observe, what the player says or what the player does in the game, and looking out for those usability issues or those cues that there is a problem with the game. This can be done later because we are recording the session. You don't necessarily have to do that live, but because games is a very fast-paced development environment, we often find it's valuable to do that live so that it reduces the analysis time and means we can get our results to our teams quicker before they've moved on to the next bit. A researcher then end up with a lot of raw data. There's all the observations of what players did and said in the game. There's lots of quant measures, such as how many times they failed on the level or what happened when they were playing through. And again, a researcher will have to analyze all of this to find the meaning in it. What are the answers to the research objectives? Did the players learn all the core things they needed to learn, and were they able to do it? We'll have to go through all the raw data to find out the answer to that before sharing the findings with the team. So communication is one of the core skills for a user researcher. There's an issue for user researchers that although we end up knowing the most about the player's experience and the issues in the game, we're not the decision makers who actually do something with that. We are not the game designers who decide how to fix it. And so it's our responsibility to make sure we are accurately conveying an understanding of what happened in the game and what happened in the study to our designers so that they can make the best decision possible in how to fix it. Traditionally, that can be a report, like on the slide here, where we describe an issue, why that issue occurred, and also the impact of that issue on players. But you can go beyond a report to do this, and there's much more interactive ways, such as running a workshop or making that research process collaborative so that designers join you throughout that journey, which can help improve the communication of the issues with the decision makers and make sure they've understood it without relying on a report, which can often be quite a dull thing to present. So that's the end-to-end of a study, and I guess a study is the bread and butter of what a user researcher does. However, as user researchers in games, and I think outside of games, user research isn't a discipline that's recognized everywhere or valued as much as we as user researchers think it should be. And so it falls on user researchers to spend a lot of time explaining this is what we do and this is why we do it and these are the benefits to you as a designer, and don't worry about all those myths you've heard that will make your game easy or will change your creative vision. We spend time explaining to our design teams and the teams we work with why we think user research is important and that it does help support the creative process rather than run over the creative process. So because of that, another core skill that a lot of user researchers have to focus on is advocacy, talking about research, making sure it's understood, involving people in the process, and opening up that research process so that people do take advantage of our services and the work that we do. Research is also an iterative process. We talked at the beginning about how important iteration is to making games better. And one of the issues or things that happen after a study is we've learned a whole bunch of problems with the game, and the design team will go away and make some changes to try and fix those problems. At that point, we don't know if they have successfully fixed the problems or not, or if the issue still exists. And so because of that, we always recommend following up with another test where we can both verify that those fixes have fixed the issues, and it probably reveals a whole bunch of more interesting issues that were hidden by those big first issues that we would have not discovered if we hadn't continued, iterated and running more studies. So what I hope I've explained about a games user research study is that we take the discipline and the practice from user research elsewhere and from the UX industry, and we apply that to the development of video games. That raises the bar from those informal playtests that studios are familiar with and have been doing for years, and helps them get more reliable results, help them get more accurate and efficient results, and just raise the quality of the playtesting that happens inside game studios. If this sounds interesting, that's fantastic. I hope it has sounded a bit interesting. The next topic that I wanted to cover, and the last topic for today, is how does someone become a games user researcher, or how do you start a career in this area? I guess the first question that people have is it worth it working in games? Is it as fun as industry as you imagine it would be? And there are lots of really good things about working in games. A couple of them that jump out to me include the fact that it is an entertainment medium. You're bringing joy into the world by making a thing that makes people happy. A lot of people play games, are very passionate about it. And so it is nice to bring joy into the world through creating entertaining experiences. Also, the people you work with are extremely passionate about it as well. I guess one of the downsides about working in games is that often it pays less than other types of software. You could make a lot more working in a bank, for example. But that means that the people who are there are very passionate. They're there because they love games, they're very interested in games, and they want to make a good game experience. And so it's really nice to be working in an industry with people who care as much about what they're making as you do. Also, as I alluded to at the beginning when I talked about virtual reality, there's a lot of new technological opportunities and challenges in games, which leads to really interesting research questions. Often the first commercial applications of new tech, such as VR or motion tech, when everyone was talking about motion tech about 10 years ago, or augmented reality, it does come out through video games. And so as a researcher, you encounter lots of really interesting research questions that haven't yet been answered, such as how do you move in VR? How do you tell people what they can interact with in VR? How do you communicate these things to the player? Those are interesting, unanswered research questions, and it's nice to have the opportunity to work on them. Unfortunately, though, it's hard to get a job running user research studies for games. A couple of reasons that occurred to me about why it's difficult. First, game development is very geographically specific, and there are hubs for game development in places like San Francisco or Montreal or London. But if you live in a different area, because there are no game studios, it can be very hard to get a job working in games without having to move. And a lot of people aren't in the life positions where they can move home, for example. Also, we touched upon the maturity of research practice inside games. So although big studios have dedicated games user research departments and employ a lot of people to run these types of studies, smaller studios often don't consider it a core part of what they do and will instead either hire an agency to do a bit of it at the end of development, but not employ a full-time researcher throughout the game development process. Because of that, again, that means fewer opportunities. And also, you've probably heard of the idea of crunch in games. It's not every studio, but some studios do suffer from a poor work-life balance where they ask you to work on weekends or very long hours, relying on your passion to ship the game and hit that deadline, as we talked about earlier, how important the deadlines are for games. Again, that's not compatible with everyone's life, where they can give up their personal life for a bit to focus on their career. And so that can make it difficult to find the right opportunity to work in games. Because there are so few opportunities, you have to, and there's a lot of competition, particularly for junior roles, you have to be a very good candidate when the opportunities do come up. And so the last thing I want to touch on for the next couple of minutes is just some of the skills that look good when you're applying for roles, or the skills that you can practice so that you can be a fantastic candidate for a games user research role. The first one, and I guess the most fun one, is you have to understand games, particularly popular games in the genre of the place that you're applying for works on. There's two reasons why that's important. We talked about your relationship with the game developers and why you have to work with them to define the objectives for your study. You have to have a good enough understanding about the game development process, how they work and what they're working on, and what the different roles inside games do, so that you can have a sensible discussion about what a research study could look like, and make sure that you are explaining the right findings to the right person. You also interact a lot with players. As a games user researcher, we saw how you moderate sessions, you sit with a player and you talk to them about the game, what they're thinking or what they're doing in the game. You have to understand enough to be able to, if a player references a game, to know what they're talking about so that you can then communicate that to a third party. If they say, well, I prefer the menu system on Destiny than how it's done here, if you haven't played Destiny, or at least you don't know how the menu system works, you aren't understanding what the participant is telling you, and you're going to lose the fidelity of that data when you tell it to someone else. So playing and understanding games is very important. There's also a lot of skills that user researcher applies to run research studies like we talked about earlier. Not all of these do you need to be a researcher to develop, and you can get skills from elsewhere to apply to look like a good candidate for a games user research role. We've talked about how important it is to communicate well with your colleagues, to understand their priorities, what they're working on, and frame your research study so it's meaningful to them. And so any experience of working with people from other disciplines, having meetings in a business setting, understanding their priorities, and just working with others is really important for being a user researcher. We also talked about how we match research objectives to study and design a study for that. Again, that is a core research skill, and a lot of people come from an academic background where they've designed studies for psychology or HCID courses. It is a thing that you can practice in your own time. You can come up with some research objectives and then design a study to answer those research objectives based on a game you've played, or based on seeing some in-development games from indie designers online. But being able to take some objectives and then come up with an appropriate study is extremely helpful to a skill for a user researcher to have. Perhaps one of the hardest to practice is the idea of moderation. Again, unless you're lucky enough to be in an academic setting or be in a job where you do get to work with members of the public already. Moderation is a skill where a user researcher has to both give tasks to participants, ask them questions about what they're thinking or what they're doing, while being careful to not lead them. Don't give them the answer or feed them the line you want them to say. You want to ask them questions in an unbiased way to get the truest data possible. Again, that can be a difficult skill to practice, but from academic experience or from other jobs, you might have the opportunity to work with members of the public or to run a study, and that will give some background so that you can take that forward to an application. Analysis is a thing that isn't impossible to do by yourself, and one of the, we mentioned at the beginning, the mentoring scheme. One of the tasks we set people on the mentoring scheme, or that we have set people on the mentoring scheme before, is to play a game, either a game that is released but not that good, or an in-development game, so that we know there will be usability issues. Identify some usability issues as if they're running a usability review, like we covered earlier, and then analyze those issues and communicate them. And again, that idea of spotting some issues in the game and thinking about how to communicate them is a core part of the researcher's skill set, and a thing that you can practice by doing usability reviews on games you play at home. Two more skills that are important. Presenting. We talked about how the user researchers aren't the decision makers, and we need to make sure that we're effectively communicating what we're learning in the study to other people. Lots of jobs or academic experience does give you the opportunity to practice presenting, but again, making sure you can be understood by people who aren't your discipline. So as a user researcher, that I can talk to people who are not user researchers and make sure they've understood what I've talked about is very useful. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the last one about facilitating. Although we don't solve issues ourselves, often user researchers work with teams to workshop and help them come to the right solution. Being comfortable running a workshop or facilitating a session where you put some structure on that discussion and make sure that people end up with some actions they're going to do, again, is a fantastic skill for user researchers to have, and can probably be gathered from any sort of business setting where you're working with team members. You don't have to already be a user researcher to have this kind of experience. The last couple of points. So it's all well and good having all these excellent skills, but you also want to show that you can do it. And another thing we recommend on the mentoring scheme is writing a blog, for example, where once you've played a game and you've identified some issues, you can make a blog post where you share, here's the issues that I found in the game, and explain why you found those issues. And it gives you a chance to practice a lot of those skills around analysis and communication that are very important. An example of someone who did that, so Bill Hardin was looking for a job in games, and so he made his blog where he wrote about usability issues, including some from Horizon. He now has a job inside games and works as a games user researcher. And although I have no insight into the process, I imagine it's helpful that he has this back catalogue of things he's worked on that he can show publicly. Look, I've had a history of finding usability issues in games, and it's obviously something I'm interested in, and that can help your job application. There is also a really good community out there, and I would recommend someone interested in this joins the Games User Research community. I've got some links on the next slide, I think. There's the Games Research and User Experience Special Interest Group. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it is a community of games user researchers or people who want to be games user researchers, where they do a lot of community activities to help grow the industry. One example, such as the one on the side here, is they run a question of the week thing, where every week they set a question and everyone answers the questions, and by being exposed to that, you get to see some different insight into how different teams work or what people are thinking about inside games user research. And by participating in things like this, or they do a reading group as well, you can start to be a member of that games user research community. They also run conferences both in North America and in Europe as well. And so taking part in those conferences, the tickets to this one I think are free. You again start to become part of the community, see what the community is talking about, and it really helps show that you can do this job by being a member of the community already. that was everything I wanted to cover. I know we've got a bit of time, and just a couple of links about some of the things we've talked about. I mentioned my book. The website gamesuserresearch.com both has a link to the book, but also has a bunch of free content to read some of the book for free. It also has the monthly newsletter, which is starting, on tips for how to become a games user researcher. And I also mentioned the community, the Games Research and User Experience Special Interest Group. Their website, grux.org, has links to their Discord group, the mentoring scheme, the other initiatives they're working on, like the conferences, and is a really great place to look at as well. Also, I'm very enthusiastic about games user research. I'm always happy to chat. Do drop me an email or send me a message on Twitter, and I'd love to talk more about it. But, thank you for your time listening today.
Thanks a lot, Steve. That was brilliant. I mean, to be fair, I usually switch off during these things, but this is the first time I've actually sat all the way through riveted. And also I really love your slide style. It's really easy to digest the content. So thanks a lot. I mean, I'm not sure you saw while you're presenting, but we've got quite a few questions prop up in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll read them to you in that order. And then if anyone else has a question, if they don't mind putting their hands up, I'll come to them afterwards. Does that work for you?
This all sounds good. Yes, I haven't looked at the chat yet, so
yeah, I'll just sort of read them out. I'll be your Debbie McGee or something. So, question regarding not testing with those not familiar with games. Does that mean marketing is not aimed at attracting new players, or is that a different, separate test?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you can see the argument for why do you not want all games to be accessible to all, and it does feel sensible to make games accessible to everyone, including people who've never played a game or this type of game before. Mm-hmm. It does feel like that would be a separate study, identifying what the barriers are to it, to playing. I guess thinking about it from a commercial perspective as well, it would have to be part of a wider scheme with marketing, for example. If they are aiming this game at an audience of people who've never played games before, you would then want to run those type of studies. Otherwise, if you just ran the usability studies, but there was nothing to attract that audience to the game, although you would create a very accessible game, people would be unaware it would exist. It wouldn't really be relevant for the people who do end up playing your game.
So this is sort of, I mean, another question sort of leads on from that. It says, aren't design excluding a potentially untapped audience by only focusing on those who are already engaged in the genre/medium? For someone who is totally new to gaming and therefore lack that prerequisite gaming literacy needed, there appears to be many barriers in place. As a result, they potentially face digital exclusion. This could be highlighted as a HCI issue with other mediums like websites, apps, etc., but not so much in gaming. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it definitely exists. I guess the commercial pressure of games means they prioritize fixing issues for their existing audience before moving on to a new audience. But yeah, again, combining it with proper, rather than just doing usability testing to resolve it, it's a multifaceted issue that does involve, okay, how do we make this audience aware that this game is suitable for them? It's a really interesting topic, but one that I haven't personally explored in huge depth.
But I suppose, like you mentioned, the commercial concerns. Like I tried to answer Linda in a question. I was saying, if you've only got like an hour of someone and that someone doesn't understand the fundamental controls, you're going to lose out lots of insight that you would get unless you get someone that already knows what they're doing, sort of thing. So, this whole gaming literacy might be a completely different area which needs to be explored that goes beyond getting feedback on a game in development, sort of thing. Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
Cool. Question, does this also pertain to serious games? I think that most of what you discussed today. This is from Michelle.
Yeah, I don't have an informed answer. I've never worked on serious games, but I guess a lot of these principles are about, okay, there's likely to be some barriers that are stopping your users experiencing the game in the way in which you want them to, and because of that, it's going to impact your learning objectives or what you're trying to convey to them. That practice of let's put users in front of games and make sure they're interpreting and using it correctly, I think applied 100%, even though it's not something I've done myself.
Yeah, so it could be applied. It's just you'll analyse it slightly differently, maybe, or your goals or tasks will be, what your intention from it might be different.
Yeah, I guess the biggest change would be about the research objectives, because again, I'm unfamiliar with serious games in great depth, but I assume you want someone to take a message away or take a lesson away from it. And so you would form a research objective about, do people learn that lesson from this experience, and why or why not?
Cool. So a question from Karishma. When observing players one-to-one, would you say their behaviours are natural/realistic, or do you have to take in consideration that it may be altered due to being observed by another person?
Yeah, definitely everything you do is impacting the player's experience. I think it's impossible to remove that entirely. There are some steps we take to try and reduce that. There is thinking about the environment you're in. A common mistake that game teams might have the first time they do this is they might have it in a meeting room where they've got all their awards that say, look at all the fantastic games you've made and look at the exciting promo picture for our upcoming game. And that's going to definitely influence both people's behavior and also their willingness to express what they're experiencing. As a moderator, I guess it's also a skill to create empathy and rapport, and some things we do include distancing ourselves from the game. We explain, hey, we didn't make this game, we don't care if you like it or if you don't like it. It's okay to tell us these things, we won't be angry. And so we take some steps to try and mitigate this, but it will influence people's behavior and expressed opinions to some extent.
And I suppose that's the nature of any user testing, isn't it? I mean, games is just one aspect.
It is, yeah. And I guess every method has that. So you could do something unmoderated to try and mitigate it. But again, that method has some impact on the shape of the data you get back. So yeah, just being aware of these and trying to mitigate them is really important.
Cool. So now we've got a great question from Elizabeth Chesters. What's your best, worst, funniest war story from being a game user researcher? Obviously, considering NDAs.
Yeah. It involved working with a lot of kids, which is great for a number of ways. One of the nice things is their brutal honesty. So if they're having a horrible time, they will tell you or ask to play other games or just get bored or wander off. But it also does mean awkward situations. Not me personally, but a colleague I worked with have had fights break out between the kids in their research sessions. We've had suspicious stains where the kid might have not felt comfortable asking to go to the bathroom, and yeah, you get a lot of interesting situations working with kids, which a bit of games user research involves.
Oh, right. So it's like never work with children or animals or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. And so Joanna Kowalik has said, why would a studio choose to employ a user research team over the alpha/beta testing, or would they run both aside from budget?
What's the question? What stage it was?
Why would they employ a user research team over alpha and beta testing? Like, are they two separate things? Do they work hand in hand? You know, does budget make them choose one over the other? I think that's where she's getting at.
That's a great point. And I think they're not necessarily different things. So my understanding about game development is they do have, so there's stages of game development, and you hit like an alpha gate or you hit a beta gate when the game's at different stages. Mm-hmm. At that point, teams often think about, okay, we're going to test it. We're going to play test it and we're going to put it in front of people, and in the alpha stage, see if they understand it or not. In the beta stage, do that kind of balancing things. I think that is what a games user researcher does. We just apply a structured approach to that to make sure you're not missing data that would be useful and that you're not missing opportunities. I guess something that is different is QA, and what we do as user researchers isn't QA. We're not looking for bugs. And so we'd recommend doing this in addition to QA and looking for bugs. But we think that throughout development, you are coming up with these decisions. And so at alpha gate and beta gate and throughout, we can be running these types of studies.
Yeah, and you might want to spend a budget on both, otherwise you'll end up with Cyberpunk or Watchdog Legion and end up with too many bugs.
QA is very important.
Yeah. Cool. And question, how does, I've got like probably 4 or 5 more questions. I mean, we'll try and run as many as we can in time, if that's all right, Stu.
Super, yeah.
So from Alden, how does user research integrate with the rise of early access games, widespread beta testing capable of generating high levels of media attention, e.g. Valheim?
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the advantages of early access is that some of the risks that games are worried about information being leaked is no longer an issue because it's out there and in the world, and that opened up a whole bunch of new research methods that we can use. One of those research methods is things like Steam's playtest tool, where you can put it in front of hundreds of people and then you can distribute surveys to them, or you can use analytics from the games to get feedback. So really it just becomes another tool in the researcher's toolkit and open to more options for what's an appropriate method we can apply to answer these research objectives. So that's been really positive. Obviously not every game is in that situation where they can share early and then use some of these playtesting tools, but when available, it's really helpful to researchers to at least be able to pick that if they feel that's the right method for this objective at the time.
So basically by doing that, it does open up other opportunities. It's not like you're neglecting the whole lab-based testing. You can do all sorts of other things as well as that.
Yeah, what's really important is matching your objective, what do I want to learn with this study, with the method. So as long as you are doing that bit sensibly, it's just another method that you can draw upon to do that.
Cool. Sorry, a few more. I'll try and close by 2 so you can get on with your day.
Right.
Question, are you working with others? What are the challenges to embedding more diversity, gender, but also ethnicity, cultural background, etc. into the games industry? Focus on games UX in this case.
No, that's a great point. One of the things so I talked very briefly about some of the challenges working in games, including the geographic limitation, and also the fact that in some studios it can take up your life. You can't balance that with having a real life if you are working 80-hour weeks, for example. The sad ramification from that, I guess, is that does disproportionately impact certain groups. You're more likely to be a caregiver if you're in some specific genders or some specific races, and that is negative and not what we want to have in the industry. I don't have I know there's lots of really good initiatives out there to help make game creation more inclusive, but I think it is a thing that the industry does need to reflect on, improve its ability to give people an appropriate work-life balance, improve its ability to make opportunities available to people outside of the typical game sphere. And there's a lot that can be done in this space. So I think it's a really good topic.
And I suppose if people aren't of the sort of traditional thing, doesn't mean they can't make games of their own volition. Now that there are tools out there to do it. So it's kind of, you could build your own, maybe.
Yeah, but yes, I think the industry needs to be better as well.
Yeah. I mean, the industry definitely needs to be better. Sorry, I'm not getting weighing into that one. Okay, so I'll do 2 more questions, guys. I'm sorry, but there's no time for any more. I'd like to ask you how to summarize map domain issues and recommendations you saw in testing back to the dev team. So this is from Matt Correll. I'd like to ask how you summarize and map the main issues and recommendations you saw in testing back to the dev team. Outside of games, you often see quite linear maps of user flows, etc. But I imagine in games there are many more possible variants. So I suppose it's like, how do you make the findings more sexy or interesting or something?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think in many ways, games is behind other industries in this, possibly because a lot of it is usability testing rather than understanding people's current needs or current behavior. So a lot of the things you see, like journey maps, are less common inside games, and people do unfortunately fall to, I'm going to write a report and then the report is going to tell you the answer. Again, I think there's a lot of games could be learning here from UX and user research practice outside of games, and that's an area that games can develop. But yeah, I haven't seen any great examples currently of games doing it better than outside.
Okay, cool. So I've got one last question from Elena Denisova. She's one of our academics that specialises in games, so probably the best person to end on. How do you convince your designer colleagues to make the changes you're proposing based on the usability testing you conducted?
Yes, that's a very good point. And we could do an hour on this, I imagine. Yeah. 2 important bits of it, I guess, are setting those research objectives collaboratively. If you are running the study on things they care about, they're more likely to care about the results because you didn't just go away and come up with what you think the study should be on. You worked with them to understand actually what are they thinking and doing at the moment, and made sure that your test targets that. I guess the other one is moving beyond just giving them a report which they can ignore or put in a drawer, and finding ways to open up the research process to those designers so that they see this firsthand, they become convinced and they care about it. The most obvious implementation of this and the most shallow is getting them to observe usability testing sessions. But beyond that, there's a lot you can do to make analysis a collaborative activity, for example, or other ways that you can expose them to participants and increase their understanding and awareness of that these are real issues and they're worth taking action on.
Brilliant. So get them to watch the session, workshopping the findings, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Great.
Opening it up.
But yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for everyone for your time today. Thanks a lot, Steve, for giving up your time and for this amazing talk.
That's all right. About the questions that we didn't answer, as I mentioned, send me a tweet or drop them by email. I'm really happy to pick them all up. Sorry we didn't get to all of them today.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to carry on the conversation on Twitter, as Steve said, he's very happy to carry on. But yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll call it a day. Yeah, I really appreciate this, Steve, and I hope we catch up again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for joining everyone today. I've enjoyed sharing it with you.